I've always believed in God, or at least I thought I did. I grew up in a little town called Fairhaven, Nebraska, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and Sunday service is the biggest event of the week. My parents were the type who never missed a sermon, and I followed suit, mostly out of habit. Faith was something I had because I was supposed to, not because I ever truly questioned what it meant. But as life went on, I realized something. It's easy to say you believe in God until you really need Him to show up. I had been out of work for nearly a year, ever since the auto shop I worked at went under. 30 years of fixing cars, and suddenly I was just another unemployed guy pushing 50 with nothing to show for it but overdue bills and sleepless nights. I prayed. I really prayed. Every morning, every night, hands clenched together so tight they ached. But as the months dragged on, the silence felt louder than my words. Then things got strange. It started on a Tuesday night in October. I remember because I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of overdue notices, pretending not to hear the scratching sound coming from the living room. It was faint, like paper shifting against wood. Probably just the wind coming through the old window frame, I told myself. But when I got up to check, I found something I know wasn't there before. My Bible was open. Now, I'm not a man who leaves things lying around. I'd last read from that Bible weeks ago and had left it shut on the shelf near my bed, but there it was, splayed out on the coffee table, the pages slightly curled as if it had been waiting for me. The verse, Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. There was something even more unsettling. The verse was underlined in red ink, but I hadn't marked anything in that Bible since I got it. I closed it. I put it back on the shelf. I told myself I was just forgetting things. I went to bed. That night, I heard the voices. It was around 3:13 a.m. when I woke up. Not the way you normally wake up, stretching, yawning, rolling over. No, this was a sudden jolt, like something had yanked me out of a dream. The room was pitch black, but I could hear them. Soft, whispering voices. They weren't coming from outside, not from the neighbors. They were inside my house. I sat up, heart hammering. The whispers were low and rhythmic, almost like a prayer. At first I thought maybe I left the TV on, but no, the screen was blank. My old clock radio sat on the nightstand, silent. I forced myself to listen. Deliver him, deliver him, deliver him. The words slithered through the dark, barely above a breath. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and stepped into the hallway. The air felt wrong, thick and charged, like the air before a lightning storm. The house smelled different, too, almost like old books and damp wood, like the inside of a church that hadn't been opened in years. The voices grew louder as I walked toward the living room. Deliver him, O Lord. I rounded the corner, and the moment I stepped inside, they stopped. The living room was empty. The only sound was my own breath, ragged and uneven. Then I saw it. The Bible was open again. But this time, it was on Daniel 6:22. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. I grabbed the book, flipped through the pages, looking for, I don't know, a rational explanation, but every page felt untouched, except for that verse, underlined in red. A cold chill slid down my spine. Someone had been in my house. Or something. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had done it, that in some half-sleep, stressed-out state, I had underlined those verses myself. Maybe I had even been whispering in my sleep. Maybe I was losing my mind. So I did what I thought would bring me some peace. I prayed. But this time, it felt different, because deep down, I wasn't sure who I was praying to anymore. That night, I made sure every door was locked, every window shut. I even dragged a chair against the front door just in case. I wasn't taking any chances, but when I woke up at exactly 3:13 a.m., I knew none of it had mattered, because they were back. Deliver him, O Lord. The whispers curled through the air, slipping under the doorframe, seeping through the walls. This time, I didn't move. I just listened. The voices weren't just in the living room. They were right outside my bedroom door. The air turned ice cold, The floorboards creaked. I grabbed the bat, I took a breath. I swung the door open. Nothing, just silence. The Bible was back on the coffee table, open to a new verse. This time, it was Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still. I dropped the bat, sat down, and finally understood. I had spent months begging for a sign, for proof that God still heard me, and now I had more than I ever wanted. I don't know if the whispers ever left after that. Maybe I just stopped listening. But that Bible, I never moved it again, and I never prayed for proof again either. Some things, some answers, you don't really want. I haven't slept right since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. Maybe it's in my head, maybe it's something else. Either way, I moved. Packed my bags and left Fairhaven behind. You'd think that'd be enough. You'd think if you ran far enough, you could escape the things that haunt you. But some things don't stay buried. Some things follow you. I tell myself that what happened to me was just a one-time thing, some kind of supernatural fluke, a bad dream that bled into waking life. But then I hear stories about people feeling something watching them, whispering in the dark. I tell myself it's all just nonsense, but deep down, I know better. Maybe that's why Rachel's story hit me the way it did. Maybe that's why, when I heard what happened to her, I knew she wasn't crazy. She lived in Chicago, in one of those old studio apartments with thin walls and pipes that groaned like dying animals when the weather turned cold. A writer, trying to make a living off words, though most of the time she barely scraped by. She liked the solitude, the way the city hummed outside her window but never quite reached inside. But that night she wasn't alone. It was raining. One of those heavy Midwestern storms that shakes the windows and makes the world outside feel like it's coming apart at the seams. Rachel had been working late, half distracted by the lightning that flickered like a bad strobe light. Then she heard it. The sound of something, someone, outside her door. At first she thought it was just another drunk. Her building wasn't exactly high semper, and people wandered into the halls all the time. But when she glanced through the peephole, she froze. There was a man standing there, barefoot. His clothes were soaked through, his jeans clinging to his legs, a dark jacket hanging off his shoulders like dead weight. But it wasn't his clothes that made her breath hitch in her throat. It was his face, or rather, his lack of expression. His eyes were locked on her door, unblinking. His mouth was slightly open, lips moving, but there was no sound. It was like watching a puppet whose strings had been cut, something that shouldn't be standing on its own. Then his hand moved to the doorknob. Rachel took a step back, heart hammering. The knob rattled as he twisted it once, then again, harder. She told herself to stay calm, to think. She reached for her phone, fingers clumsy and shaking, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? She swallowed. There's a man outside my door. I don't know, he's trying to get in. The dispatcher asked for her address, her name, her description of the man. She tried to give details, but all she could focus on was the sound of the doorknob twisting, slow and methodical. Then it stopped. Silence. She held her breath, her pulse a roaring static in her ears. She glanced back through the peephole. And he was gone. The hallway outside was empty, the only sign that he had ever been there, a dark, wet footprint just in front of her door. The cops showed up 10 minutes later, did a walkthrough of the building, but of course, they didn't find him. Probably just some junkie, one of the officers said, writing down the report. They wander in sometimes when it's raining. But Rachel knew. She knew because the next morning, when she finally worked up the nerve to check her door, she saw the scratches. Tiny, deliberate marks right around the lock. Someone had been trying to pick it. She hadn't imagined it. He had been trying to get in. That's when she learned about Miss Delgado. Miss Delgado had lived in the apartment next to hers for the past 6 months. Kept to herself, older woman, always carrying grocery bags up the stairs. But that morning, the landlord told Rachel she was gone. Moved out last night, he said, shrugging. 2 guys came to get her. Rachel frowned. She didn't say anything about moving. Wouldn't be the first time. People come and go in this building. That was the first red flag. The second came when she saw the news. Rachel wasn't much for morning TV, but something about the report made her pause. A high-profile trial had just wrapped up in Los Angeles. A former cartel member turned state's witness had testified against one of the biggest drug rings in the country. His name? Miguel Delgado. Her neighbor's last name. It could have been a coincidence, but then she saw the footage. The camera cut to a woman being escorted out of a courthouse, surrounded by federal agents. A woman with the same gray-streaked hair, the same sharp profile. Miss Delgado. Witness protection. Rachel's blood ran cold. The man outside her door, he hadn't been there for her. He had been there for Delgado, but he had gotten the wrong door. That realization made her stomach turn. That if she had opened the door, if he had gotten in, he wouldn't have just walked away. Rachel moved out a week later, packed everything into a couple of suitcases, and left the city behind. But even now, she still dreams about it. About the man with the dead eyes, about the way he had stood outside her door, moving his lips but making no sound. She dreams about what would have happened if she had been just a little too slow, if he had found the right door. If Miss Delgado hadn't already been gone. Some people say you should always trust your instincts. Rachel learned that lesson the hard way. I haven't been able to shake Rachel's story. The way she described the man outside her door, the eerie silence of his lips moving with no sound, the scratches on the lock. It all stuck with me like a bad dream that lingers long after waking. I told myself it was over, that she had gotten out in time, that Miss Delgado had probably started over somewhere far away, under another name, but the thought kept creeping into my mind. What if the man had gotten in? What if Rachel hadn't trusted her instincts? That's the thing about horror. It doesn't come all at once. It seeps in, piece by piece, crawling under your skin, settling in your bones. And for some people, it isn't a shadow at the door or whispers in the dark. Sometimes the real terror is living right next to you. That brings me to Derek's story. Detroit isn't what it used to be. Parts of it still look like a city, parts look like a graveyard. Empty lots where houses used to be, whole neighborhoods swallowed up by decay. But you get by, you work with what you've got. That's what Derek Caldwell did, a mechanic, good with his hands, the kind of guy who kept his head down and minded his own business. Which is probably why he didn't notice his neighbor wasn't who he said he was. Derek had lived in the same run-down apartment building for years. The kind of place where the heat barely worked in winter and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's arguments. People came and went all the time, but he never paid much attention, until Alex moved in across the hall. At first, Alex seemed normal enough. Mid-30s, quiet, always wore the same black hoodie and jeans. They ran into each other a couple of times in the hallway. Derek tried to be polite, gave him a nod, even said hey once or twice. Alex never said much back, just kind of mumbled and kept walking. Then Derek started noticing things. Different men coming in and out of Alex's apartment at all hours. Some of them looked rough, shifty eyes, sunken faces, the kind of guys you don't want to be alone with in an alley. Others looked well-dressed, clean-cut, like businessmen. There was no pattern, no reason that made sense, just a constant stream of strangers. At first Derek ignored it. Wasn't his business, wasn't his problem. Until one night, he stepped out to grab a smoke and saw something that made his stomach drop. Alex was leaving his apartment, except it wasn't Alex. The man locking the door was taller, thinner, and had a completely different face. But when he turned and saw Derek standing there, he smiled like he knew him. "Hey man," the guy said, voice casual, like they were old friends. Derek hesitated. "Where's Alex?" The man raised an eyebrow. "I'm Alex." That was when the feeling set in, that deep, crawling unease that tells you something is very, very wrong. Derek forced a nod, kept his expression blank. The guy, Alex, or whoever he was pretending to be, grinned, gave a lazy wave, and walked off down the hall like nothing was out of the ordinary. Derek went back inside and locked his door. He barely slept that night. Something wasn't right. He had seen Alex before. He had spoken to him. He knew his face. And that sure as hell wasn't him. The next day, Derek ran into his landlord in the hallway. The guy was a piece of work, always late on repairs, but he knew who lived in the building. "Hey," Derek said, trying to sound casual. "Well, who's the guy in 4B? The landlord squinted. 4B? That's Marcus. Derek felt his stomach turn. Marcus? Yeah, the landlord said, scratching his head. Been renting here for almost a year. Huh. Derek didn't say anything, just nodded and walked away, even though his mind was screaming. A year? Alex had only moved in 3 months ago. That night, Derek kept an eye on the hallway. More men coming and going. Some stayed a few minutes, some stayed longer, and at one point he heard crying, faint, muffled, coming from inside 4B. The kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wanted to ignore it, he really did, but deep down, he knew he couldn't. He waited until the hallway was empty, then crept closer to the door, pressed his ear against it. A voice, low, male. Shut up, just shut up. A sound like something hitting the wall. Then more crying, softer this time. Derek stepped back, heart hammering. He didn't know what was happening in there, but he knew it wasn't good. He went back to his apartment, picked up his phone, called the cops. They didn't sound particularly interested at first. Probably thought it was just another domestic dispute, but Derek must have said the right words, because 20 minutes later he heard heavy boots pounding up the stairs. And then, chaos, shouting, doors slamming, the sound of something breaking. Derek cracked his door open just in time to see SWAT officers in full gear storming 4B. He didn't know what he expected, but when they dragged the girl out, barefoot, eyes wide with terror, he felt something in him break. She couldn't have been older than 16. They arrested 4 men that night. Marcus, or Alex, or whatever his real name was, wasn't one of them. He was already gone. Derek never found out the whole story. Not really. The news said something about a human trafficking ring operating out of Detroit, using apartment buildings like his as holding spots before shipping the victims off. The girl had been missing for months. Derek couldn't stop thinking about it, about how he had lived next door to it, about how he had almost ignored it, about what would have happened if he hadn't called. He moved out 2 weeks later, found a new place across town, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled against the windows, he thought about Marcus, about how he was still out there, and about how many other places were just like his building, just another apartment, just another neighbor, just another locked door hiding something monstrous. There's a moment after hearing a story like Derek's when you start questioning everything. You wonder how many doors you've walked past without thinking, how many faces you've nodded to in the hallway, how many people have lived just a few feet away, separated only by thin walls and locked doors, hiding horrors that no one ever saw. It makes you paranoid, makes you rethink the way you look at the world, but paranoia isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's what keeps you alive. That brings me to Brian Foster. Brian wasn't looking for trouble. If anything, he was looking for an escape. He had always been restless, never quite fitting into the world the way he was supposed to. College had been a disaster. He dropped out after 2 years, realizing that whatever he was searching for, it wasn't in a classroom. That's how he ended up in Asheville, North Carolina, deep in the mountains, at a place called the Path of Light Retreat Center. It was one of those places you find on obscure travel forums, promising spiritual enlightenment, higher consciousness, all that new age stuff that people cling to when life isn't giving them answers. Brian wasn't religious, not really, but something about the place called to him. Maybe it was the way they described it, a sanctuary from the distractions of the world, a place to reconnect with the self. That sounded good. That sounded like what he needed. So he went, and for a while it was everything it promised to be. The retreat was nestled deep in the woods, a collection of small cabins surrounding a central meditation hall. There were about 20 people there, all seeking something: peace, understanding, clarity. They spent their days meditating, practicing breathing exercises, talking about energy and vibrations and things Brian didn't fully understand, but it was nice. It was quiet. Then he met Jonah. Jonah had been at the retreat for months, maybe longer. No one seemed to know exactly when he arrived, but he had a presence, the kind of quiet, unshakable confidence that made people listen when he spoke. He never blinked enough. That was one of the first things Brian noticed. Jonah would stare at you for just a little too long, his blue eyes sharp and unrelenting, as if he were seeing something beyond you, something you couldn't understand. He spoke in slow, measured sentences, always about awakening, transcendence, the power of the mind over the body. "You're carrying too much weight," he told Brian one evening as they sat by a fire. "You have to let go of your attachments, your doubts, your fear. Only then can you ascend." Brian had heard plenty of hippie talk since arriving, but Jonah was different. He believed it. And the others? They believed in him. People gravitated toward Jonah. Even the retreat leader, a woman named Mara, seemed to give him a certain level of deference. He led meditations. People sought him out for guidance. But there was something else. Something off. At night, Brian would wake up to whispers. Not conversations, not people talking in their cabins. Just one voice. Low. Rhythmic. Chanting. The first time he thought it was a dream. The second time he followed the sound. He crept out of his cabin barefoot on the damp grass and followed the murmur through the trees, past the meditation hall to the clearing at the edge of the woods. And there, under the pale glow of the moon, was Jonah, sitting in the dirt, completely naked. His arms were spread wide, his head tilted back, eyes shut. His lips moved rapidly, whispering a language Brian did not recognize. For a long moment, Brian just watched. Then Jonah's head snapped forward. His eyes locked onto Brian's. A slow smile stretched across his lips. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. Brian ran. The next morning, he told himself it had been a nightmare. A trick of the dark, of exhaustion. He decided to avoid Jonah, to keep his head down and finish the last week of the retreat without drawing attention. But Jonah found him. "You saw something you weren't ready for," Jonah said, his voice calm, his gaze unreadable. "You're not ready yet, but you could be." Brian tried to play it off, laugh it away, but Jonah only smiled. "I can show you," he said. That night, Brian locked his cabin door. It didn't help. Sometime after midnight, he woke up to the sound of breathing, slow, deep. Inside his cabin, Brian didn't move. He lay frozen in his bed, his back to the room, listening to that steady, unnatural breath. Inhale, exhale. Then a whisper. "Let go." Brian bolted upright. The cabin was empty. But the door was unlocked. That was it. He was done. At sunrise, he packed his bag and walked straight to Mara's cabin. "I need to leave," he told her. She studied him for a long moment, as if considering whether she should let him go. Then she sighed. "If that's what you feel is right." She handed him his car keys and wished him well. Jonah watched him from a distance, standing by the tree line. Brian didn't look back. He drove straight home. 2 weeks later, he saw the news. The Path of Light Retreat Center had been shut down. No explanation, no details, just gone. And Jonah? Jonah had disappeared. Vanished into the woods. No trace, no sightings, no answers. Brian tried not to think about it. He tried to move on, tried to tell himself it was all just another weird chapter in his life. But sometimes, late at night, when he's lying in bed, he swears he hears it. That slow, steady breathing, and a whisper, "Let go." I don't know what's worse, not knowing what's lurking in the dark, or realizing you were standing right next to it all along. That's what I kept thinking about after Brian's story. He had gone looking for answers, and found something he couldn't explain. Something he could barely even understand. Maybe it was supernatural, maybe it was just human madness. But whatever it was, it left a stain on him. Some people chase the unknown. Others try to ignore it. And some don't realize they've been living with it until it's far too late. That brings me to Grace Holloway. Grace lived in Portland, Oregon, in one of those quiet, tree-lit neighborhoods that felt safe, even when the rest of the world seemed like it was falling apart. A single mother, raising her daughter while working a demanding job as a nurse. Life wasn't easy, but she made it work. And part of what made it feel manageable was Mr. Lawson. He had lived down the street for years, a friendly old man with a small bakery attached to his house. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him. Kids would wave at him as they rode their bikes past, and he'd always wave back. His meat pies were famous, not just in the neighborhood but all over town. Grace had bought them plenty of times. She had smiled as she handed over cash, chatted about the weather, complimented him on his homemade crust. She had eaten them more times than she could count. And then, one evening, the police came. It started with the missing person report. Some homeless guy, the kind that people usually forget about. But then another one vanished. And another. All of them seen last near Maple Street. Grace's street. She only noticed because the police kept driving by, slowing down as if searching for something. Then, one night, she woke up to flashing red and blue lights outside her window. She stepped outside, watching as officers swarmed Mr. Lawson's house. There was shouting, then the sound of wood splintering as they broke down his door. She stood frozen in place, heart hammering as they carried out the first body, then the second, and the third. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering in hushed voices, horrified gasps breaking the quiet. The bodies were fresh. Someone muttered something about the basement. Grace felt sick. The news broke the next morning. Mr. Lawson had been killing people. Not just recently, for years. Mostly vagrants, drifters, people who wouldn't be missed. They found pieces of them buried behind his house. Some of them had been there for decades, but the worst part, they found remains in the kitchen, in the freezer, in the pies. Grace sat on her couch, the TV blaring, but she couldn't process the words. She stared down at her hands, trembling, trying to remember. How many had she eaten? How many times had she stood in front of him, smiling, handing over money for something that had once been a person? She ran to the sink and threw up. Her daughter found her like that, sobbing, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand. The days after were a blur. The entire neighborhood was in shock. People stopped talking to each other, avoided eye contact. Nobody wanted to admit how many times they'd all eaten his pies. The police said Lawson had no real motive. He just enjoyed it. Grace couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, smiling, friendly, like he always had been. Then one day she found an old missing person poster online. A woman, one of the victims. And Grace realized why she looked familiar. Because she had seen her before, on Mr. Lawson's porch. The woman had been there once, years ago, standing next to him, smiling. Grace had assumed she was a friend, maybe a relative, but now she knew. She had smiled at her, and a few weeks later, she had eaten her. Grace moved a month later, took her daughter and left the city behind. But sometimes, when she walks past a bakery, when the scent of freshly baked meat pies drifts through the air, she has to fight the urge to scream, because she can still taste them, and no matter what she does, she can't forget. There are some things you can move on from. You can pack your bags, change your address, leave the nightmares behind. But what happened to Grace? That kind of horror doesn't fade. It sits in your stomach like a weight, reminding you that the world is far darker than you ever thought. She never ate meat again. That's what she told me. I don't blame her. How could you, after realizing you had unknowingly eaten human flesh, after realizing you had smiled, laughed, and shared small talk with a monster? Some horrors are hidden behind locked doors. Others sit right in front of you, disguised as something safe. And then there are the ones that live inside of us, the kind that no lock or distance can protect you from. That's what happened to Tanner Blake. Tanner had lived in Austin, Texas, for a few years, bartending at a trendy little spot on the east side. He wasn't the kind of guy who scared easy. He had seen it all. Drunks getting violent, fights breaking out, people getting carried out in ambulances. He could handle himself. But his roommate, Kyle scared him. Not at first, of course. They got along well enough. Kyle was quiet, worked as a software developer, kept to himself. But after a few months, Tanner started noticing the sleepwalking. It started small. Kyle leaving the fridge open, Kyle standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night staring at nothing. At first, Tanner thought it was funny. "Man, you were standing in the living room last night for like 5 minutes," he joked one morning. "Just standing there, like a damn zombie." Kyle had laughed it off. "Yeah, I used to do that as a kid, no big deal." But it got worse. Some nights, Tanner would wake up to the sound of footsteps. He'd walk out of his room and find Kyle standing in the hallway, motionless. His head would turn slowly toward Tanner, his eyes open but blank. empty. Once, Tanner tried to guide him back to bed, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Kyle flinched. Then he whispered something. "It's here." Tanner felt a chill run down his spine. "What's here?" he asked. Kyle didn't respond. He just turned and walked back to his room, closing the door behind him. The next morning, Tanner asked him about it. Kyle had no memory of saying anything, probably just dreaming, he said, brushing it off. But Tanner had a bad feeling, and that feeling turned to full-blown terror the night he woke up and found Kyle standing over his bed. Tanner's eyes snapped open to the feeling of something watching him. Kyle was there, standing perfectly still. His face was inches away from Tanner's. His eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them. Tanner's breath caught in his throat. "Kyle?" he whispered. Kyle didn't respond. Then, slowly, his lips parted, and he whispered something. "I don't want to go." Tanner sat up fast, his heart hammering. "Dude, you're scaring the hell out of me. Go back to bed." Kyle blinked once, twice. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Tanner sat awake for hours, listening. He didn't hear another sound. The next morning, Kyle was gone. Tanner called. No answer, texted, nothing. Kyle's car was still outside, but his bed was untouched. Something wasn't right. Hours later, the police knocked on Tanner's door, and what they told him made his blood run cold. Kyle was dead. They found him on the highway. He had gotten into his car sometime in the early hours, started the engine, and driven straight into a concrete barrier. At full speed, no braking, no attempt to turn, and the worst part, his eyes had been open. Tanner sat through the police questioning in a daze. No, Kyle hadn't been suicidal. No, he hadn't been acting strangely, at least not while he was awake. But he sleepwalked, Tanner finally admitted. Could he have done it in his sleep? One of the officers gave him a look. "Son, nobody sleepwalks into a car crash." Tanner didn't argue, because deep down, he wasn't sure that's what had happened. A few days later, Tanner got a call from Kyle's sister. She was devastated, of course, but she wanted to ask Tanner something. "Did he ever talk about the dreams?" she asked hesitantly. Tanner frowned. "Dreams?" she sighed. "Kyle used to have these episodes, night terrors. He'd wake up screaming, saying something was in the room with him. Said he could see it in his dreams." Tanner's mouth went dry. "He stopped talking about it when we were teenagers," she continued. "Said it was gone. But a few months ago, he told me, it came back." A heavy silence filled the line. Tanner swallowed hard. "What came back?" There was a long pause. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "He just called it the passenger." Tanner barely slept after that, because he kept remembering that night, Kyle standing over him, whispering those words, "I don't want to go." And now, Tanner couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle hadn't been the one driving that car. Something else had taken him, something that had waited, something that had watched. And now, when Tanner wakes up in the middle of the night, when he feels that strange, crawling sensation at the edge of his consciousness, he doesn't open his eyes, because if he does, he's afraid he'll see Kyle standing there again, and this time, he won't be alone. The world is full of shadows. Some we see, some we ignore, and some we don't realize are there until it's too late. Each of these stories, as disturbing as they are, carries a truth that can't be ignored. Fear is often not about the unknown. It's about what we refuse to see. Ethan's story reminds us that faith is tested in silence, in those long, agonizing moments of doubt. Sometimes, the answer we seek doesn't come the way we expect, but just because we don't see immediate proof, doesn't mean we aren't being watched over. Sometimes, the unseen is working in ways we can't yet understand. Rachel's story teaches us to trust our instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Fear keeps us alive, but ignoring it can get us killed. It's better to feel a little paranoid than to regret not acting when it mattered. Derek's experience is proof that danger doesn't always look like a masked killer in a dark alley. Sometimes it's quiet, it's next door. It's behind a door you've walked past 100 times. Evil thrives in secrecy, and the worst of it hides in plain sight. If something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. It could be someone else's life at stake. Brian's encounter at the retreat reminds us that not every place promising enlightenment is safe. Not all knowledge is meant to be found. Some things change you in ways you can't undo. Be careful where you go looking for answers. You might not like what you find. Grace's nightmare is a stark reminder that we never truly know the people around us. We think we do, but we don't. Sometimes monsters smile and hand you a pie. The world isn't always what it seems, and what we consume, both physically and mentally, deserves more scrutiny than we often give it. And then there's Tanner. His story is the hardest to understand because it doesn't fit into the usual logic of the world. Was Kyle sleepwalking, or was something else pulling the strings? Sometimes the enemy isn't outside our walls, it's inside us. We all carry something we don't fully understand. The question is, who's really in control? So what do we take from all this? Stay aware. Listen to that voice in the back of your head. If something feels off, pay attention. If you see something wrong, don't stay silent. And above all, don't let fear control you. But don't ignore it either. To everyone who made it through these stories, thank you. Your time is valuable, and the fact that you spent it here means more than you know. If these stories resonated with you, if they made you think, then they've done their job. This is Enigma of the Unknown, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe.